So as soon as Katie does that, I should be able to.
Oh, Katie got it. Thank you. All right. Well, welcome everyone. My name is Teresa Holt. I'm the State Director of AARP Alaska. On behalf of our agency, we're happy to welcome you to the third in a 5-part series on the fall harvest. We're doing this with the Cooperative Extension Service. Today, Sarah Lewis from the Cooperative Extension Service's Juneau is going to be teaching us how to preserve herbs for the winter. Let's see if I can get the screen to change. There we go. Before we get started, I do want to just show a few things for those who are not familiar with Zoom. So in the picture here on the left side, you can see the mute. If you're not muted, go ahead and mute yourself. We just do that to keep the background noise down. But if you want to ask a question, you can unmute yourself and ask a question. We encourage you to stay on video, but you don't have to. There is also a chat function. You can see that. It's the one that says chat underneath with the little speaker bubble. We encourage you to use that to ask questions. We've also asked people to just let us know where they are today. So go ahead and put in chat what community you're joining us from. And then if you look on the very far right, you'll see the reactions button. That's where you can raise your hand, and I can watch as we go through this. And if people raise their hand, then we can unmute you and you can ask a question live. I think that's it for this slide. Just wanted to do a quick spiel about AARP because not everyone on here knows what AARP is about. Basically, we're a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization for people over the age of 50. We have 38 million members nationwide and 77,000 members in Alaska. We're the largest membership organization in Alaska. Our job really is to help people choose how they live as they age. To do that, people really need to do 4 things. They need to save in retirement because you have more choices if you have more funds at the end of your life when you're retiring. Stay healthy and fit, both mentally and physically. Build strong relationships with family and others in the community, and have meaningful activities, something that you like to do. And the ways we do this is we do it through advocacy. You may have heard about recently, we worked pretty closely at the national level to get prescription drugs included in Medicare negotiations. We always look out for Medicare and Social Security and make sure those continue. At the state level, we work on things like broadband expansion, having a sustainable budget, the senior grant program, which funds a lot of services for seniors, caregiving, healthcare, those type of things. We do education like this today. We've had several webinar series. We've done a series on technology, veteran services. We had a really popular one in the spring on gardening. We do fraud, caregiving resources, financial planning, so all of those things. And then member engagement, we try to engage members. Pre-COVID, we did that in person. We're getting back to in-person events, but through social groups, movies, you may have heard of AARP's Movies for Grownups, guest lectures, and we hope in the coming year to offer some exercise classes online. And then we do community action. And so we have groups in Juneau, Ketchikan, Anchorage, Matsu, and Fairbanks who are working to make their communities better. Now I'd like to introduce Sarah Lewis, who's coming to us from her home kitchen, which is really exciting. She works at the Cooperative Extension Service, and she's going to talk to us today about how to preserve herbs at home. And this is true whether you grow them in your garden or you purchase them from the store. It's great to have them in the wintertime. Sarah will be hosting this class from her kitchen. She will teach us how to dehydrate herbs, create culinary salts, infuse vinegars, and flavor sugars. Preserving herbs is a great way to make sure this precious harvest never goes to waste. Sarah is an MSW and an associate professor at the Extension Service for the Southeast Districts of the UAF Cooperative Extension Service. Home-based in Juneau, she's been teaching home skills and local food workshops throughout Southeast since 2012. In addition, Sarah is the author and editor of several UAF extension publications and considers herself lucky to be able to teach practical and interesting fun classes from her home to her friends, neighbors, families, and communities throughout Alaska. I'm going to stop sharing and we'll let Sarah take over.
Thank you, Teresa. I appreciate it. And I'm really pleased to be partnering with AARP for this series. I think I'm doing maybe 2 of the classes over the course of this series. So come on back for, I think I'm doing maybe the pickling one later on, but thank you for that introduction. I am on a computer that I had to switch to quite quickly when my normal computer would not charge. So it has a smaller video frame than my other computer. So I'm gonna do a little bit of moving around, but if there's ever a point when I'm back here cooking, like right now, and you can't see what I'm doing, someone feel free, maybe Teresa or someone, go ahead and holler out, move your camera, because I don't normally have to do that. So it might not be entirely on my radar. All right, so I'm Sarah Lewis. Great introduction. Thank you so much. Yes, I'm in Juneau, and this class. Oh, first, before I start, Teresa, is this will this class be done at noon or 12:30?
At noon.
Okay, I'll talk fast then. I just wanted to know how to pace myself. So I started this class. I developed this class because here in Juneau, periodically, we have live basil. There's some folks who do some indoor growing of live basil. And so that means that's the basil that you find in the store that's actually like in a sleeve and it's living, it's got its roots and everything. And people were super thrilled about it. But then we'd be getting our live basil home and we'd use, 2 or 3 bits. And if you're not a pesto person or you don't have something for the whole thing, basil was tragically being wasted. Local basil was being tragically wasted by folks. So I kept on getting questions about how can I use my basil. So originally this class was called All About the Basil, but then I quickly, of course, determined that it would be great to include all herbs and quickly preserving herbs. So I mostly am going to be talking about pretty easy ways of doing things. And really most of the ways of preserving herbs are pretty easy. You really don't need any special equipment. I will show you some special equipment should you like to purchase some, but mostly it's very easy. So first, I'm gonna try to get my kitchen in. So mostly this is where I'm going to be. So it looks like you might be able to see me. My screen is.
Yep, we can see you. It's a little harder to hear you. We can see you, but it's a little harder to hear you.
Oh, shoot. Okay. I apologize. Well, I may have to, it's always hard when you're working with a new computer. I may just talk louder. How about, Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, I'm good with projecting. I'm okay with that. So I'll go ahead and yell. There's no one else in the house right now because this is the first day of school in Juneau. So I'm all on my own with the dog. All right, so first of all, I would like to talk about, at the very beginning, is if you are growing your own, their harvest times, it tends to be better when you're talking about leaves and things like that. It tends to be better before the plant blooms. And sooner in the day tends to sometimes be better for some. Don't let these sort of constrain you. So go ahead and pick your herbs when you need them. That's perfectly fine. But if you're going to be doing like a large amount of them, before the plant blooms, pick the healthiest leaves. And that can be hard when we sort of segue to the purchase, because throughout Alaska, I know that this is not just Juneau, but we get these great little boxes of herbs, and sometimes they're a little on the old side, so there might be some brown things in there. None of the methods that I'm talking about are going to save herbs that have already started to turn. So steer clear of anything that's already starting to brown. Mostly browning is the issue, because if it's already starting to dehydrate, because maybe you've had it on your counter and it's starting to dry, they might still be useful if they've just started to dry already. So you want to, when you are harvesting from your own plants, be conscious of the rest of the plant, of course. So just pick what you need. Be careful when you're picking so that you don't hurt the rest of the plant. That should be pretty obvious for most gardeners. And if you're going to be harvesting a whole plant, like the live basil or something like that, or something that you grew specifically to, take out the whole plant at some point, then go ahead and leave the roots on. Segueing to putting them, storing them in the refrigerator. Most types of herbs will do okay in the refrigerator. Basil and a few of the tender herbs that have certain essential oils, every once in a while they won't. So if you have specific herbs that you like to store that you have and you want to store in the refrigerator, try them out and see how they do. One way you can do this is, wet a paper towel, wrap it around the end of the herb, or if it's a living plant, then wrapping, with a wet paper towel. If you're going to put it in the refrigerator, trying to keep that moisture around that paper towel with some a plastic bag. Those are all options. If there are some plants that do well if you cut them like chives, for example. If you cut them and then put them in a little cup of water and then put them in the refrigerator, that can be a good thing to do. Try different things. It works for some, it doesn't work for others. And so the next step, of course, is if you want to do something other than the refrigerator, because you've got a lot to deal with, you don't have plans for it. Aspirational herb purchasing is an issue in this world. And so if you've purchased something for one specific recipe, but you've got the rest of the box or the rest of the plant, that's what I'm going to mostly be focusing on. So first of all, cleaning. Let me make sure that, okay. So cleaning, if you are going to be dehydrating your herbs, whether that's by hanging them or in an actual dehydrator, don't wash them if they're not visibly dirty, because getting them wet can actually, lengthen the drying process. It's also, another opportunity for you to bruise those leaves and things like that. So if it's not visibly dirty, and maybe it came from your own garden, and the conditions, then perhaps don't actually wash it. But if you are going to be, putting an herb into to sort of infuse it in something, whether that be oil, vinegar, mustard, I'll talk about all those things. It is not a bad idea to go ahead and rinse it first, because you're not worried necessarily about dehydrating it. And there are two ways you can rinse it. So if you do notice that some of your herbs are starting to turn a little brown, maybe they were purchased, it's not a bad idea to rinse it in water that has a little bit of hydrogen peroxide added to it. And the ratio is kind of a funky one and is usually much bigger than what I use, but 6 cups of water, 1 tablespoon of hydrogen peroxide. So I've probably got maybe 2 cups here. So I'm gonna, hydrogen peroxide is actually, pretty safe. It's not like bleach or something where if you have too much of it, it can be a problem. So I will often literally just do a squirt when I'm doing a small amount. If you're going to be doing a lot of herbs, go ahead and do that. 6 cups, a nice big bowl of water, put 1 tablespoon of hydrogen peroxide in there. And all you're going to be doing is just dipping and swirling. That's all you're going to do. So here's some oregano that came from the store. I see some brown bits, which means there's already some microorganisms on there that are starting to do things. So then I have to, of course, remember which one's the hydrogen peroxide. So this one. So dip, swirl. You don't really want to get in there and mess with the leaves, because that, of course, can break them down and damage the leaves. And then put it somewhere to dry. You can pat it dry a little bit, leave it for a little bit just to dry on its own. Super easy. You can also just rinse it in standard water if it's more like you're just trying to get dust off or something like that. If you have a dusty garden, things like that, rinsing it in water is also just great.
Sarah?
But if you're going to be drying, perhaps don't rinse. Did I hear a question?
Yeah, so what does the peroxide do?
Oh, it's actually a disinfectant, if you will. It's a sanitizer. It's not a disinfectant. It's a sanitizer. So it's actually killing some of the microorganisms that are already starting to spoil part of your herb. So you probably can't see it, but this leaf right here already has some brown on it. That might just be, you know, aging or enzymes, but it also might mean that there's, you know, there's microorganisms around us all the time. And some of them, most of them are wonderful and either harmless or helpful, but a few are, you know, dangerous. I'll talk about that later. But in this, we're really only talking about they might be spoiling your herb. So one, I know that they're there, so I'll swirl it around to sanitize it. Great question. Thank you. And then I will remove any of the leaves that have actual brown on them. So, and then let that dry. So, and other than that, really washing, like I said, washing isn't a great idea if you are going to be, dehydrating, because it adds water to something that you're wanting to remove water from. So, next, so I've talked a little bit about putting them in the fridge. There are a couple of different ways to freeze herbs. So I don't have any basil here, but a great method with basil or things with larger leaves is to do what's called the cigar method. And what you do with that, and I apologize, I can't demonstrate it, but when you kind of think about it, it makes some sense. So what you do is you've got the larger leaves, because you're going to be freezing them. It's not a bad idea, and not dehydrating them. It's not a bad idea to go ahead and rinse them if you know that they're either dusty or, you know, they're starting to brown in some areas. Then what you do is you lay the leaf out and you just roll it up. And then you take another one and roll it up. And what you do is you sort of lay them out so that they are like shingles, you know, partly on top of each other. And then you roll them up, or you can put them all on top of each other and roll them up. And then what you do is you just put them in you wrap them in a little bit of plastic, you twist the ends, and you have a basil cigar. And then you can put that in the freezer. What is terrific about that, and I may actually, I might not have it. I might have taken it to the boat, but I used to have a little basil cigar in here. I did find my butter, I'll show you. But what you do is you open up one end of that plastic and you literally just cut slices off. It's frozen, it's easy to cut. You put it in whatever dishes that you want to use it in. Super easy, and that's for freezing. So another way that you can freeze herbs, and this is only freeze, is in oil. If you're going to be infusing in oil, because of some food safety issues, you only want to save that by freezing it. You don't want to infuse oils and save them long-term in the refrigerator. There are some issues that have to do with putting, it's a whole other, you know, pH class about acidity and food safety. But when you're putting herbs, and especially garlic, into an oil, it does actually have the potential to have bacterial growth. And because the oil creates an anaerobic environment around that low acid food, which is what herbs and garlic are, and it can actually, there can be bacterial growth and there can potentially be botulism growth. So if you're infusing, just in general, if you're going to be infusing in oil, put it in the freezer, not the refrigerator. If you want to put it in the refrigerator because you're going to be using it, short-term use within the next 3 to 5 days. That's great. So that's like when you make fresh salad dressings. You want to make your fresh salad dressings, and in commercial kitchens, they are required to only have those an amount that can be used within a short period of time because of that infusing things in oil. So refrigerator, but it's awesome. So again, you know, thinking about basil, or I've got some thyme here, and you can, ratios are kind of up to you. The oil is really more of a storage medium. And of course it gives flavor to the oil as well, but it's a way for you to freeze a whole lot of herbs, you can do them in ice cube trays, for example. So cut up a lot of herbs or take the little leaves off of the thyme, put it into ice cube trays. You can really pack them in there if you want, depending on, you know, how much herb you want, and then just cover it with oil and put it in the freezer. And then you have ready-made little bits of herb infused oil, but the goal is the herbs, and the oil is kind of a little bit of a bonus. So another way that's somewhat similar is I pulled out butter. Butter is another great way to preserve herbs. And again, you want to freeze this. And so it's a very similar thing that I talked about with the cigar method, in that what you do is you mix the herbs with the butter, and, you know, in general, like 1 cube of butter, 4 tablespoons of herbs, but none of this is safety. That's entirely taste. And so 1 cube of butter, 4 tablespoons of fresh herb, give that a try. It can be mixed herbs, it can be a single herb. And then, you know, it's room temperature, soften the butter, mix it all together, roll it up, use some waxed paper, and then you can just periodically open the end, cut off some of that butter. Or if you're super fancy, you can put it in a mold. I clearly didn't. This is for cooking use, not for impressing the guests, but you can do it in a mold as well. And then you've got a lovely herb butter for a dinner or whatever. I noticed some chats. I will check these periodically. Excellent. So what kind of oil do you recommend freezing the herbs in? The oil that you like. It can really be any oil that you like. So olive oil, you know, it depends on what you're going to be using the oil for. So if you tend to cook with olive oil, freeze your herbs in olive oil. If you tend to cook with canola oil, freeze them in canola. If you think you might be using those herbs for salad dressing, freeze them in the oil that you might use typically for salad dressing. You know, so the butter is okay in the fridge, but again, you want to use it for its relatively short-term use. So like if you want to keep it for more than a week or so, go ahead and freeze it. And it also allows you to do big batches of it, and it really doesn't change the quality at all. So I actually tend to freeze it even if I'm going to be using it relatively soon, just because then it's already frozen, because I might not use all of it. Just put it back in it, and it thaws quite quickly. So it's it's something that you can pull out on relatively short notice and have it work for you. Oh, that's, maybe if we can hold that infused oils at craft shows to the end, and we'll see if there's some time for questions. That's a whole other thing. So they might be commercially produced, or they might not. And that's the key. Are they commercially produced, even if it's locally commercially produced, or are they a cottage food? If they are a cottage food, then no, they actually shouldn't be doing infused oils as a cottage food. Yeah, so that's a good question, but maybe we can get into that a little bit later if we have time. Okay, so butter is a great one for freezing. Then let's get into vinegar infusion. These are a couple of my favorites. I'll actually talk about vinegar and I'll talk about mustard at the same time, because it's kind of the same thing. One thing that I really like to do is, and do I have one out? No, I think I used it already. But I love vinegar. I have all types of vinegar in my home. And so I've got lots of partially used bottles of, so this is champagne vinegar. I like wine vinegars. I like beer vinegars. I like vinegar, balsamic vinegars, white and red. So yeah, lots of vinegar. And one of the things that I do is if I've got a couple of sprigs of something that's left over, I especially like rosemary, I also like thyme, I will actually, if I've got a half, if I've got a partially used bottle of vinegar, I'll just open the top, I'll put that sprig just down in the vinegar. Different from oil, because vinegar is a very high acid food. And so what you're doing basically is you're kind of pickling, if you will, the herb, but you're also, the flavors from the herb are going into the vinegar. The vinegars you want to use are those that are a little bit less like fruit forward, or, apple cider vinegar has a very strong taste of its own. I like champagne vinegar, white wine vinegar, rice wine vinegar. They do have different flavors, but when you add the herb, you can taste the herb. Red wine vinegar can actually work, rosemary, but you want to add a bit more because the vinegar itself is relatively strong, flavored on its own. And then you can do the exact same thing with mustard, because mustard is actually it's a pretty high acid food because mustard actually has vinegar in it. And as you probably experienced, mustard lasts a good long time in the fridge because it's very high acid. And so sometimes I will actually, in a nice little thing like this, I will actually, and I'm going to do it right now, by golly, I'm going to put some thyme in it. Because I'm not dehydrating it first, I am going to rinse it in water. Actually, this was a little brown, so I'm going to do it in the hydrogen peroxide. Then I am going to just dab it dry, just so I'm not adding too much moisture to the, sorry, I should talk louder, too much moisture to the mustard. And then for this time, I'm just going to pull those leaves off and put them straight into the vinegar. Into the mustard. If it is an herb that, like the rosemary, I would probably chop that up. I'd take they're fairly woody rosemary leaves. I would pick several leaves off. I would actually chop those up before putting them in the vinegar. In the mustard, because we tend not to want to have lots of big chunks. It'll be surprising to people to have big chunks of something when they're spreading their mustard on their sandwich. Whereas vinegar, you can leave them pretty whole because it's actually the vinegar that you're going to be using. Sometimes you might get a leaf or something like that if you're making a salad dressing, but that's usually not as much a concern. And so I am getting a little spoon because I'm just going to stir this in. And this will just add a little flavor to the mustard. It's still totally usable in the same way I use my mustard. I use mustard a lot in salad dressings, obviously sandwiches, etc. So, but it's a really great way to quickly preserve some herbs. I see a question. You know what? All of these, the question is how much herb for a jar of mustard? All of these are kind of taste. If you only have, 3 sprigs of thyme, go ahead and put that in. If you have a lot of an herb, you might want to, depending on, the mustard is pretty strong flavored, so you could probably add a fair bit to that and not have it, be overtaken, or it might be really good overtaken by the flavor of the herb. It's entirely taste, really. So experiment and see how it goes for you. All right, so this will go back in the fridge. All right, so vinegar infusion, mustard flavoring. I talked a little bit about oil infusion. And a good way to do that in the freezer, like I said, is in, ice cube trays. But you can also do larger amounts in small plastic containers or glass containers, whatever you use in your freezer. Usually smaller amounts are better. But what's nice in terms of just using it all up in a period of time, and if you haven't infused, if you haven't frozen herbs in an oil, do small amounts until you know what you like, what you use, because you don't want to waste it. So smaller amounts. But what's nice is it doesn't freeze solid. So if you have a little container of an oil with herbs in it, you can just scoop some out. It'll just scoop out and you can use it. So a container with a wide lid is a pretty good idea for that. Salting herbs. There's 2 ways to deal with salt. If you freeze basil in oil, totally up to you. Probably chopping it up is going to be tend to be the most usable. But there might be some recipes where it's kind of nice to have that whole basil. So if you were doing something that was maybe Thai based, a lot of times they do have whole basil leaves, but other times you're doing something that might be more Italian, and they tend to have chopped up. So in all of this sort of preserving your herbs, think about how you're going to use it before you preserve it, and try to preserve it in a way that is most like what you already do, so that you can just fold it into the cuisines that you like to do on a regular basis. Recommendations for preserving chives. I actually have some dried chives here that I was going to add to salt. So thank you for that lovely segue to my chives. So chives can be preserved in all these different ways that I'm talking about. They're pretty good because they've got that nice, oniony flavor. They retain their flavor pretty well. So I have some dried chives here that one piece of equipment that can be helpful is an herb grinder. Yes, you might look at this and say it's a coffee grinder, but if my husband ever uses this to grind coffee, he needs to buy me a new herb grinder, because you don't want to grind coffee in this, because then all of your herbs will taste like coffee unless you think you can really clean it well. So this is my herb grinder. And so these chives, they were just sliced and dehydrated. So you can probably see it there. They're not real fine, but I want to put them with some salt. So I'd like them to be a bit finer. So what I will do is put them in my herb grinder here. You can also, if you don't have an herb grinder, you can just chop them up. Just best to chop them up a bit, or if they're dry, you can actually like put them in a bag and just sort of crumble them up, put them in a plastic bag and just squish them so that they get a little bit finer. So let me go ahead and try this. Yep, that's looking pretty good. I'm gonna do a little bit more. This was about, dusty, watch out for the chive dust. Okay. So this was about 3 tablespoons or so of the larger pieces. And so it'll be about 2 tablespoons of the smaller. And so when there's 2 ways to think about salting. So already dried herbs, or herbs that you choose to dry because you're not sure how you're going to use them yet, and you use them later, which is like this. You can just go ahead and put them straight with your favorite kind of salt. So what I have shown here, standard table salt, that's awesome. I also have some kosher salt, also great. Based on what you're going to use it for. I tend to use kosher salt for cooking. So when I make a culinary salt with kosher salt, it's going to tend to be something that I'm going to cook with. If it's going to be something that I might sprinkle, a finishing salt, like I sprinkle it on top of something rather than cooking it in, I will tend to use whatever my favorite table salt is that I use in the household. There are different grain sizes, so this tends to be pretty fine, and this is a coarse kosher salt. So think about that as well. So chives, I tend to use that as a finishing salt, like on top of potatoes or things like that, not as a cooking salt. So I'm going to go ahead and use my table salt. But the ratio, if you're going to be using dry herbs, going ahead and using 4 to 5 tablespoons to a half cup of salt. I have about 2 tablespoons of the herb. And so I'm going to eyeball a little bit. So let me put these, let me disconnect it from power. I'm just going to put this in here. I'm going to take a look at it. Yeah, it's about 2 tablespoons, I'm going to guess. And so I think I'm going to just pour in. And what I really do like to show people is this is super easy. I love to show people super easy things where they go, wow, I didn't really need a class for that. But at the same time, it's good to have a class for it so that you learn about them. So I probably put almost equal herb to salt because I want it to be pretty flavored. Again, I'm going to mix it up a bit. And yeah, and so you just try to blend it in. I have an example. I mean, what can be tricky is, of course, that salt is a finer grain. It might fall to the bottom. So you might have to actually kind of stir it up on a regular basis. So this is a mixed herb that I use for cooking, a mixed herb salt that I use for cooking on a regular basis. I believe this was a very sort of standard, sort of Italian-ish. I think I have basil, oregano, maybe thyme is in there. I actually see maybe a little bit of, I might have at some point added some lemon rind to this to give it a little bit of zest. So and then right when I'm going to cook with it, I kind of shake it up a little bit. And, you know, when I pull it out, I try to make sure that I've got a good mix of herb to salt. So that's an easy way to deal with dry herbs. But you can also make salts with fresh herbs. It's a little bit, I guess, sort of longer process because what you're doing when you put a fresh herb with salt is you are actually starting kind of a dehydration process. The salt actually pulls moisture from the herb, and it also pulls some of the flavor. So that's awesome. So that's what you're trying to do, is actually infuse the salt with herb flavor. So if you kind of think about it, when you put the dry herb in, it's not going to really get that opportunity to infuse more of its flavor into the salt. You really do have to make sure that they're mixed pretty well so that you get enough herb with each like teaspoon of salt. But when you start with the fresh herb, it's actually pulling some of those flavors and essential oils out of the herb. But what it also does is it kind of makes a little bit of a wet slurry over time. So what you do, so a good salting herbs, so a good ratio when you are salting fresh herbs is a 1-to-1 ratio. So if you've got a half cup of salt, half cup of herbs, or vice versa, you can do more than that if you wish to, but that's a pretty good ratio, is 1-to-1 for starting. And what you want to do is, I actually have some that I started a little while ago, and you can't see it, just about a week ago or so. So there's a little moisture on the top because there's been moisture pulled out of the herb that was in here. I believe it was rosemary. I'll smell it and I'll tell you. Yep, it was rosemary. And so what it did is it pulled the moisture out of the rosemary. The salt also helps to preserve the rosemary. So the rosemary doesn't start to mold. The salt actually helps, keeps microorganisms from moving in because they don't particularly like that salt. But you've got it's kind of wet, you can kind of pinch it and it holds together. You can use it this way perfectly fine. But what some folks want to do just to make it so that it will last longer, so like if you're doing larger batches, what you can do with this is you can spread it out on a cookie sheet. It might be good to put some surface down on it, wax paper or something, and then just put it at the lowest your oven will go, and just give it some time to and leave the oven open slightly so that moisture can just be pulled out of the mixture of salt and herb. And then at the end, it will be kind of sort of crunchy. And so you can either break it up, you can do a mortar and pestle, you can put it in your herb grinder to break it up. Warning about herb grinders is they can make very, very fine salt very quickly, almost like a powdered salt. So I actually tend to like to just, break it up either by hand or in a mortar and pestle, just to break it up a bit. But that's a great way to make infused salt. And you can actually do something very similar with sugar. Of course, you want to be thinking about flavors. There are going to be some herbs that are great with sugar. Mint is great with sugar. Some of the flowers are very good with sugar. So you got to think about those things, whereas salts tend, of course, towards the more savory. Basil can actually be pretty good with sugar or with salt. So think about the flavors and maybe do small amounts the first time you give it a try. But they're pretty easy to do. So, and you could use brown sugar, you can use white sugar, you can use whatever your favorite sugar is. Again, whatever sugar you use on a regular basis. So one of the things that we do is, let's see, it was the first day of school today. So my middle schooler, who likes to have a skosh, this is not my idea, has a skosh of coffee with lots of warm milk in the morning. I'm not super cool with that, but he really likes that. He likes a little bit of mint sugar in with that. And so I will make him a little bit of mint sugar. I think I have a little of mint here, a teeny little bit of mint that I think I'm going to use for that purpose. Just for a little treat for him. So yeah, sugars and salts, you can do it similarly. You can start with the dried herb and mix it in with the sugar or the salt, or you can start with a fresh herb, mix it in, and then later and let it sit for a little while. And you can taste it at any point to see if you like the flavor, and then go ahead and dry it so that it's not a slurry anymore. When it is a slurry, it will actually eventually sort of go sour. It'll start to not taste great. So it's a good idea to try it if you're going to be using it for the long term, storing it for longer term. Okay. So another thing that you can do with herbs that go well with sugars is just like what I did here with this mustard. You can do the same with syrups and with honey if you wanted to. It's usually best to really chop them pretty fine or even grind them in the grinder before you add them. Just because, you know, if you think about honeys, if you're pouring it and you get a big old chunk of something, I don't know, big old chunk of mint or something like that. It's not what you expect. So it's kind of nicer to mix it in a little better. So chopping it pretty finely is a good idea. So nothing in chat right now. There's another way of preserving herbs that involves salt, but you're really salting the herbs. You're not creating salt. You will have some sort of infused salt at the end of it, but really it's more for preserving a larger amount of herbs with a smaller amount of salt. And it does exactly what I was, basically starts the dehydration process, but it's something you might want to do with whole herbs. So whole leaves rather, or whole sprigs. It's a way that you can preserve them for a bit longer. The salt pulls the moisture out of them, creates an environment that is not inviting, spoilage microorganisms don't want to move into. And so that is one way that you can also preserve a larger number in a more whole form. And so in general, 4 parts of herb to 1 part of salt, but really the goal is, and you do kind of in a layered process. So if you were to have a container like this, for example, a layer of salt on the bottom, put the herbs in a layer, another layer, you know, you can kind of see where I'm going with that. So that pretty much everything is covered with salt, but it doesn't have to be like buried in salt. So that's another way to do a larger number or whole herbs is by salting them. So I'm going to talk a little bit about dehydrating, because that is really kind of the most versatile thing to do, is to go ahead and dry your herbs. And then they're available for all kinds of different uses later on if you don't have any plans for them right now. So I actually have this relatively, simple, lightweight dehydrator that I use on a regular basis. And it's just, it plugs in to, it's electric. In Alaska, it tends, and I'm in Southeast, so I am well hydrated. We're all well hydrated in Southeast. So when we are dehydrating, most things really do need heat and a fan. There are some herbs that you can hang dry quite successfully, even in Southeast. Just pay attention to where you're hanging them. So they're not somewhere, that gets high humidity. Like the kitchen actually isn't necessarily the best place. If you do a lot of, boiling, things that create steam in the kitchen. So somewhere that's a little farther away from any kind of humidity, you can hang them with a string. A great idea is to actually wrap them in a paper bag. You can poke some holes in the paper bag, but what's great about that is it catches any leaves that fall, but still allows the air to circulate around the herb. And you can do the traditional thing, like the picture that was at the beginning of this session was a great example. I think there were herbs that were hanging. It's the traditional, lovely herb smelling kitchen kind of icon, and you can totally do that. Herbs that so basil sometimes doesn't do super well with that. It's very tender. The leaves can get sort of bruised easily, and once they're bruised, they might brown instead of drying, So, but thyme does really well. But I know that I think we have some folks here from Fairbanks where it's a lot drier in the summer, a lot warmer in the summer. There are you have a little bit more that you can do in terms of dehydrating herbs without any special equipment. But Southeast, we tend to use some special equipment. So because I don't want to have some huge thing in my kitchen, I do have this pretty lightweight one. I do also have a much bigger dehydrator that I use for jerky and other things. This is almost specifically for herbs and pretty quick drying things. So for example, I can take one of these boxes. I only have it for one recipe. I take the rest. If it's already on, on a sprig, I just put the whole sprig in. I don't take the leaves off before drying it. Depending on the herb, most dehydrators come with these nifty screens, so that if it's something with smaller leaves like thyme, it's a good idea to use one of these finer mesh screens. But also rosemary, basil, parsley, things that tend to be bigger leaves, you can just put them straight onto the rack. And what I do is, if I have, like I said, one of those boxes, I don't have any plans for the rest of the box, I will just immediately put in the dehydrator. Usually it comes with four is usually or less. And I start the dehydrator while I'm still cooking. And many herbs, so most dehydrators will come with, it'll tell you the temperature. And typically with herbs, we keep it pretty low. It's 95 to 100, somewhere in there. And that does pretty well. And they will be dried sometimes within an hour, sometimes before we finish dinner. They're dry enough for me to then put them into an airproof container of some sort. What I typically do is, depending on the amount, usually if you're just, finishing up one of these boxes, you won't have a really large amount. So I'll just get I've got a couple little jars that, I have for this purpose, and they'll fill that jar. But if you have a larger amount, it's a good idea to split it into smaller jars, because each time you open a container, you're allowing potentially moist air to come in. So keeping it in smaller containers that that you can use relatively soon, that's a pretty good idea. Also, it's a good idea in general to do smaller batches of dried herbs, because they do lose their oomph. Some folks say in 3 months or less. Although, all indications to the opposite, I'm not really a foodie person. I'm kind of okay with using old herbs. I just use more of them. But there are folks who are very, herbs are super important to their cooking, and they want them to be at their peak. So relatively short-term use is at their peak, as opposed to, we used to buy the big old, Costco thing of parsley, and then 5 years later, we're finally finishing it. By the time you're finishing it, it's kind of just basically flavorless leaves, and you're just adding a little bit of color. But so yes, so smaller amounts if you have your own herbs, or those darned expensive herbs that you buy in the little boxes, is a good idea. So there are other ways to dehydrate. I've talked about, air drying, dehydrator. You can also potentially use your stove, but it's pretty tricky because ovens do tend to run too hot. The lowest setting on my oven, for example, is 170. I do have a bread proof setting on my oven, which is much lower, but I think that's somewhat rare. So that might actually work for doing herbs, because I've always had a dehydrator. I haven't actually tried that on this oven. There's also a warm and hold, what you would want to do is with your oven, go ahead and get an instant read thermometer, whatever you use for, your meat or whatever, and just put it in there and see what it says about what the temperature is when you've got it on the lowest, whatever. You also want to have some air flow. So, keeping the door open a little bit is a good idea. There are air fryers that also have a dehydration setting. Mine does not. And so I have not used my air fryer as a dehydrator. I think I might be able to use it as a dehydrator for vegetables. Herbs, when I've taught classes that have been like a couple of weeks long and people have come back to let me know how it worked in their air fryer. A lot of air fryers are it's a bit too hot for herbs. So they actually end up sort of browning they just don't dehydrate as well as, carrots or vegetables. So, so test your air fryer if that's what you have and see if maybe it works. And if it doesn't, go ahead and maybe try your oven. And if that doesn't work, try the air or try one of all those things, maybe before you go ahead and commit to buying a commercial dehydrator. I see a couple of questions. Okay. For dehydrating dill, do you recommend using the fine mesh screen in the dehydrator, and do you cut off the big stems? Oh, dill. So what I pretty much do with everything that's on a stem is I keep it on the stem rather than trying to get the leaves off of that. But yes, I would absolutely use the fine mesh, and there's going to be some dill leaves that make it through. So when I'm doing something like dill, I try not to have anything else in the dehydrator at the same time. I try to make sure the bottom of it is quite clean as well, because a lot of that dill is going to end up down here and it'll be dry and I can collect it, but I want to make sure that's clean so that I feel comfortable doing that. And then what I do for most things that come on a stem is after they are dry, I pull them off the stem. It tends to be the easiest. Or I chop them. Like dill, you don't have to pull them all of it off the stem. You can chop it at that point. You can put it in a grinder. That'll go pretty fine if you do it in a grinder. So you can also just chop it. You can do it beforehand, but dill, I think what you're getting at is it gets very small and basically it all ends up in the bottom. Herbs that are good for hanging are those that have a nice stem. Again, you're leaving them on the stem. And so having something that you can, put a rubber band or, string or something to tie to. My experience is that basil doesn't do great in my house. I might have too much moisture. Not sure what it is for basil, but it doesn't dry very well for me. Rosemary dries actually pretty good, even though it's pretty woody. But it still seems to dry pretty well for me. Thyme dries pretty well for me. Chives dry very well. Chives, of course, don't have a stem. So that's one where I actually tend not to do that up, hanging it, just because then it actually, as it dries, it'll break. But you can put the paper bag around that and it'll catch those bits that break off and they'll continue to dry and you'll be able to collect them. But yeah, chives I tend to do in my dehydrator rather than hang them.
So there's a question just before from Cheryl. Please talk more about drying chives. I think you said you split yours.
Oh, I'm not sure what you mean by split, but yeah, drying chives, I basically so my chives that are down, I don't have much of a garden, but I do have chives because they are awesome and they come back every year and they have beautiful little flowers. So I like to dry the chive flowers as well. I do collect some of those while they're still at their peak, and they're super tasty and you can use them like chives and they still keep their color. So that's really nice. But drying chives, I usually dry them in relatively large pieces and then cut them afterwards. So this particular dehydrator, it's hard to get a lot of, because it's, chives can be pretty long. So I might cut them in half so that I can, get them along there and along there so that I can get one good layer. And when I say layer, you don't to pile them on there because they won't dry as quickly or as well if you pile them. You want them to be pretty much literally one layer high. But big chives can be hard for that. So if I have a lot of chives I'm doing, I use my square one. I have a square, big, square dehydrator. It's actually, it's my hippie dehydrator is what I call it. When my parents lived in Oregon in the 70s, they found this dehydrator that was homemade by someone, but homemade really well. So it's an old cupboard that they put window screens in. So like 10 or 15 screens. And then it's got a heating element and a fan. It's been going ever since the 70s. It's awesome. So chives, I will often do it on that because it's got nice big square screen. I hope that maybe, I'm not sure what you mean by split, but I might cut it to make it a little bit smaller. So one thing that would be great, are there any, we've heard about chives, I've heard some, questions about difference and basil and specific preservation methods. Does anybody have favorite herbs that they tend to buy a lot, that they grow a lot? Go ahead and put that in the chat. That would be great. Since we do have a smidgen of time, let me move this. Or if there's any sort of question that you had that I haven't addressed, I have a little bit of time. Tarragon, basil. So tarragon is one that I love to do in vinegar. It does nice. I just like that flavor in vinegar. So lemon balm. Lemon balm is actually, I think, my favorite herb. I actually like it best just to smell it. But lemon balm is a good one to put in sugars. It's, it's got the citrus flavor, the sort of, that tang. That's a nice one to put in to either dry it and then put it in sugar, or put it fresh with sugar, let it infuse, and then dry it all together. That's a good one. But really, lemon balm, you could also salt it, but the uses for lemon balm tend to be in sweeter things like teas and baked goods that you might not want salt with. So sugaring it or creating a culinary, a flavored sugar tends to be the best. But if you want to do like whole, like sprigs, the sugaring that isn't really, the focus isn't the sugar, but it's the preserving of the lemon balm, and it actually makes it a little bit sweeter. And then you can use it for lots of different things. And you have whole sprigs potentially as well in that case that kind of look good when you put them in tea or whatever it is. Garlic. So drying garlic, a dehydrator. You need to use a dehydrator for drying garlic. And so garlic is a little bit of a tricky one. We have 2 minutes left. Garlic is one you specifically do not want to infuse oil with unless you are freezing it, because garlic actually does have more likelihood of having harmful bacteria on it. Part of that's because it's grown in soil, and soil does have more bacteria in general, but part of that seems to be the chemistry of garlic, that it is more inviting to Clostridium botulinum specifically. And so garlic, when you dry it, drying anything does not kill microorganisms. What you're doing when you're drying is you're reducing the activity, and microorganisms need water. When you've got low water activity, there's no water for them to use to live. So that's what's happening when you're drying things. But you're not actually killing those microorganisms. So with garlic, if you dry it, you still don't want to infuse stuff with it because it still could harbor harmful microorganisms. But dry it, and then grind it up and make garlic powder. But a dehydrator is the best because it's got a lot of moisture in it, and it makes your house smell, well, not surprisingly, like lots of garlic. So it's actually pretty great to do if you like the smell of garlic. So dehydrator is the best. Thyme, very similar to all the things that I've done here. It does great with vinegars, oils, salts. You might like it with sugar. You can go ahead and give that a try. Those are all terrific.
Well, Sarah, thank you so much. We just have a couple more things to go over really quickly. Let me just share my screen. All right, so we do have a poll. Katie, can you pull up the poll just real quick? All you need to do is click on the poll and answer the questions. Did you learn something new? Was this a good use of your time? Rate this speaker. We're not going to show the results of the poll, but we really just want folks to be able to give us some feedback. All right, let's see. While that's going, I am going to click to the next slide if I can. So yeah, it looks like we have almost everybody. So go ahead and end the poll, Katie. All right. And then I do just want to share, so next week, same time, same place, Sarah's going to be back with us talking about pickling vegetables. And then August 30th, we're going to be talking about making jerky. If you missed one of the classes, you can go to, this is a fairly long link, but we'll send the link in an email. So we're going to send you the recording of this and our slides so that you can watch it again in case you missed something, or you can share it with someone who you think might want to do this. But if you go to www.aarp.org/AK, you can find this whole harvest series, and we always post the recordings there. So we hope you have enjoyed this. And let me get to the last slide. If you have any other questions, you can contact us here, but look for an email in the next couple days that'll have the recording. And thank you so much, Sarah. This was awesome. I learned a lot. I love to grow herbs, and so I've got some great new ideas. So we appreciate you.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for inviting me.
All right. Goodbye, everyone.